Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Faculty in Focus, a new university-produced video series that puts the spotlight on Marymount faculty members, their classes, and their impact on students. I'm Communications Specialist Nick Munson, and today I have the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Holly Karapetkova, a professor of literature and languages here at Marymount, as well as a renowned author and poet. Thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so first off, I'd love to see the listeners out there get some basic info, on your background as a writer as well as an educator here at Marymount and maybe before that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been at Marymount for over 12 years now. I've been here quite a while, and I love it here. I love teaching here. I love the students. I love my colleagues. It's a really fantastic small university. We're able to give a lot of personal attention to our students, and it's meaningful work, and the ability to engage with young people and young minds in such an in-depth manner is really wonderful. So I love being here. I hold an MFA in creative writing and a PhD in comparative literature, and my specialty is poetry, both the writing of it and the study of it. I also teach classes in all kinds of writing. I teach basic composition, I teach advanced composition, and I teach literature courses as well. So I teach a wide range of things. I've published several books and many poems, and I think that about sums it up.
All right. Right now, I understand a current project taking up much of your time outside of classes is Planter's Wife, a poetry manuscript project which explores slavery in antebellum America through the voices of plantation mistresses. Very interesting work. I understand that it's heavily based on primary source documents as well as historical research. Before we dive in on that, how about we hear one or two of the poems within that manuscript to get kind of an idea of what we're working on here.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with a poem called Cottonmouth. This was published in Delmarva Review, and it's about the economic implications of slavery. And it has an epigraph from a text written by an anonymous Carolinian called Slavery in the Southern States, 1852. And the epigraph reads, "And the field for cotton goods that is every day enlarging as the East is answering to the impatient calls of commerce gives no prospect of a speedy check to this vast power of the produce of the slave." Cottonmouth. Luck is a field white as stars in a sky of jade. Harvest season, heads full of cotton, hands full of cotton. We dream of buds aching green with envy, flaring their white blossoms open at dawn, pink by sundown, then red, withering until the bowls beneath crack open, foaming white. This high cotton we're rolling in, our mouths so full we choke on our own spit. And I thought I'd read one more as well.
Sure.
Again, about sort of the economic system of slavery. And this poem also has an epigraph. It's from the letters of a plantation mistress. She ran her own plantation. She was a widow, and she had control, economic and physical control over her property and her slaves. And her letters are collected in a book called Mistress of Evergreen Plantation. And this quote from her is from one of her letters to her brother, and it's dated 1832. "I have 16 young calves on my book for this year, and my guinea hogs grow finely. Black Sam's eldest daughter, Jenny, had a little daughter the 14th of April. That makes 3 mulattoes born this year and living yet." And the poem is called Transactions. "My dear brother, I rode about the fields today, first time since the rains. Happily, not all the bolls are ruined. This will be a good crop. We had some 70 bales ginned and pressed and sent down the river a fortnight past. I got 12 young shoats coming along and half a dozen calves. We'll make a fine market next spring. Also some pretty foals, and Jenny gave birth last week, which makes 3 Negroes born already this year, sucking babes, another on the way. The corn is tall as my waist, So you can see how things is progressing right well. There is more than enough to be thankful for.
The last line is pretty ironic, given
Absolutely.
all of the situation going on during that time period.
Absolutely.
Where did your interest in this topic come from initially? How did you get inspired to work on antebellum America and the slavery period?
Yeah, well, I have been writing about race for a while. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia in the 1980s, and it was a very interesting place to be in terms of racial identity and understanding of racism. I went to school with a large number of African American children. I was able to develop friendships with people who had a very different experience in the world because of their race and ethnicity. And so I had a serious understanding of race and of my own race, my own identity as a white person very early. And I really have wanted to explore the issue and began exploring the issue about 10 years ago in my poetry. Mm-hmm. And as I wrote about whiteness and critiquing whiteness, I was very curious about how we came to this present moment. How did racism develop? How did we end up where we are now? And of course, if you keep going back into the past, you end up in slavery, where racism was originated as a justification for an economic system that was immoral and unethical. Mm-hmm. And the people who perpetrated that system needed an explanation for why it was okay. And so racism was the justification that came out of that system. Mm-hmm. I also spend a lot of time in Charleston, South Carolina. My parents retired there. Mm-hmm. And so for many breaks and holidays, I go to visit them. And it's a beautiful city. I highly recommend a visit. Mm-hmm. But it's a city that hasn't really come to terms with its past yet. And it's absolutely beautiful. You can walk through the streets and see the beautiful antebellum houses. Much of the city is kept just like it would have been several hundred years ago. And I just noticed this kind of glaring silence surrounding the issue of slavery. Who built these beautiful houses? How did all of this beautiful city come to exist? And that curiosity also really drove me into historical research. Mm-hmm. I have used a number of archives and primary source research. I've used some places in Charleston, the Charleston Historical Society, and other venues. I've used the Library of Congress. It's an amazing resource.
Right down the road.
Right down the road, yeah. I've spent countless hours there delving into letters, diaries, primary source documents in particular. I've done secondary source research as well, but I really wanted to try to understand this bizarre and horrific system that dominated our country for the first years of its existence, and that really actually made us the wealthy, powerful nation that we are today. Mm-hmm. And I felt that in order to do that, I really needed to understand what the people of the time were thinking, what they were saying, how they were discussing the issue of slavery. Yeah.
And those detrimental effects really still exist even
Absolutely.
In today's American society. So
they do.
Maybe you might hear people asking why write about slavery in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. It was a couple of centuries ago. Isn't it time to move on? But really, it's right. Not like you still see its effects in everyday life.
Absolutely. And it's not just race that I find this project speaks to and our racism in a contemporary sense. The kinds of stories that the people in a slave society had to tell themselves to believe that their actions were okay are fascinating. They really had to do a lot of mental somersaults because when you think about it, slavery was a really intimate kind of a relationship. The slave owners and their enslaved peoples lived side by side. They worked very closely together. The white folks had to have recognized the humanity on some level. Mm-hmm. They had to have seen similar hopes and desires and loves and humanity. Mm-hmm. And yet they were able to deny that, even though they were in such close proximity to it. Mm-hmm. And for instance, they would tell themselves, when they would see slave resistance or, different kinds of behaviors that they thought were inappropriate on the parts of their slaves.
Reading and writing.
Reading, writing, right. Yeah, but they would say, oh, that's insolence. Mm-hmm. Or, they're just lazy. Or they are, morally inept. and they need our guidance. They need our good Christian homes. So it's really fascinating to hear the justifications that come out of that period. And I think they speak to our ability as a species to tell ourselves lies to justify the behaviors that we want or that serve our interests. And so not just racism that we see today, of course, gender inequalities, but also I think a lot about our environmental situation and our poor stewardship of our planet and the way that we tell ourselves that it's okay, like we're able to avoid it or ignore it.
The planet has warmed in the past.
Right, in spite of the fact that, the facts are right in front of us, and yet we're able to just completely ignore it and go about our daily lives, right? It's just a fact. Materialism and fossil fuels and all these things are just a part of our daily lives, and we don't recognize the harm that they're doing. So I think the kinds of ideologies that human beings are able to create and the stories that they're able to tell themselves, it's easier to see how wrong they were in the past. It's easy to look back
hindsight's 20/20
and say, yeah, oh my gosh, can you imagine owning other human beings? It's horrible. And really, when you read, there's a wonderful large collection of slave histories, of personal accounts of slavery, thanks to the Federal Writers Project that took place in the 30s. They gathered more than 2,300 narratives from people who had lived under slavery. And it's absolutely fascinating and appalling. And the fact that this was able to exist and in this society that saw itself as very civilized and refined.
The New World.
Yeah. And slave owners, and we still think of the Antebellum period as this kind of genteel, glamorous, cavaliers, chivalry, right? It's absolutely fascinating. I think it speaks to a lot of issues that we see in present society as well.
Yeah, one that has connections on everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Over the course of your research, I'm interested to know what has most surprised you.
Many things. The first thing, actually, that I was very surprised to find was the relative silence on the issue of slavery. Slavery was such a huge part of people's lives. Every day people interacted with their slaves. And the fact that most of the plantation mistresses in their letters and diaries very rarely mention slavery is really interesting. They do start to talk more about slavery when you reach the Civil War period, but it's more of a political kind of discussion and an anger and outrage at the North.
How dare they affect our way of life?
Yeah, so that was really interesting for me. Then, of course, the dissonance between the white perspective on slavery and when you read the African-American perspective and the stories of the actual enslaved peoples, the disconnect is quite big because the violence and the atrocities that were happening are often just not mentioned by white people. They were overlooked. One of the fascinating things that has to enter into this project is the regular systematic rape of female slaves oftentimes by their white masters. So a plantation mistress would often know on some level that her husband was raping her slaves, and she would know that the children that were the product of those rapes were her property. So she would be forced to face this fact on a regular basis, and yet they almost never talk about it. Almost never. And there's actually a really interesting quote. I'm going to read this from Mary Chestnut. She's one of the famous diarists. Her Civil War diaries are well published and well known. And she does speak occasionally about slavery and the evil of it. She's one of the few. And she has a couple of quotes that I find really interesting. One of them, she says, "And every lady tells you who is the father of all of the mulatto children in everybody's household, but those in her own she seems to think drop from the clouds or pretends to think." And she's got another quote. She says, "Wife and daughters, in the might of their purity and innocence, are supposed never to dream of what is plain before their eyes as the sunlight, and they play their parts of unsuspecting angels to the letter." So she's directly acknowledging the denial and the mental somersaults, again, that women went
able to
through
close their minds to,
absolutely,
like Mary says, what is right in front of them.
Yes, and Mary Chestnut is an anomaly. We very rarely see women acknowledge the wrong of slavery or regret the fact of slavery. I was hoping, honestly, when I began my research, I was hoping to find more empathy. I saw women as also disenfranchised in a sense. Women were able to own property, and they had quite a few rights in the antebellum period, but they certainly had nowhere near the kinds of rights and privileges that men did. Yeah. So I was hoping to find some kind of camaraderie or empathy on the part of women with their slaves. None of that.
How much do you suppose that's due to, at that time, almost fear of them losing rights if they acknowledge the rights of those even more disenfranchised than them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's part of racial inequality. I think that's part of how that system has been perpetuated for so long, is that white people feel somehow that by giving rights to people of color, they're going to be losing something. The truth of the matter is quite different. Of course, there are plenty of rights to go around. It's not by giving someone else rights, you actually gain more rights. It's the opposite, right? You gain more rights. And one of the things I would say that's really important to note is that slavery was not good for white people. Economically, it was good. Morally and ethically, it was horrific. Certainly, white people did not suffer the kind of abuse or violence that black bodies did. But white people suffered this kind of moral
decay.
Yeah, it's horrific. One of the quotes that I was trying to find it for this interview and I couldn't, but it stands out in my mind. I will never forget it. It's from the same Federal Writers Project, from a direct narrative of an enslaved person, and he remembers very clearly his master saying to his teenage sons, "Go down to the quarters and get me more slaves." And as a mother of a teenage boy, I think, what kind of world, how would I feel if I inhabited a world where my son was told to rape people because it would increase his property and his father's property? And, just imagine the danger, the disgust of living in that kind of world. That can't possibly have been a pleasant experience and cannot possibly have been good for white people.
Truly horrific. I'm interested in learning more about your process and the approach that you use when you're creating your poems, like the ones that are in Planter's Wife. Could you touch on that?
Absolutely. I'm a very slow and methodical worker. I give my poems a lot of time before I expose them to the world. So I usually will work on a poem for about a year before I show it to anyone, even to a writing group. And many of the poems in this project have been in process for 5 years or more. Wow. So I work very slowly, and I need the time to look back on my work with clear eyes and clear vision and make sure that it's really expressing what I want it to express in the best way possible. And it's hard to do that. It's hard to be objective about your work right after you've written it because you love it. You think it's amazing. It's just, it's the way that creative writing works. You're always in love with your work at first. And so the more time passes, the more objective you're able to be. I always have multiple projects in process, and that way it doesn't feel like I'm sitting around waiting years and years and years to publish one book. I have another manuscript that's in process now that's about more contemporary issues with racism, critiquing whiteness in a more contemporary sense. And I've got another manuscript that I'm also working on. So I always have multiple projects, multiple, things going. Yeah. So the time doesn't feel like I'm just waiting and waiting. I also do a lot of translation. I translate poetry from Bulgarian. Right, yeah. So that's a whole different kind of outlet too.
Yeah. So get a little variety.
Exactly.
In your work. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's been a great conversation with you. Before we wrap up, I want to see if there's anything else you'd like to add, maybe about the impact of this work, maybe on your students or others in your field.
Absolutely. Well, my understanding of race and the history of racism and the history of slavery absolutely impacts the way I'm able to teach, the way I'm able to have conversations about race and inequality in the classroom. I've also been able to give this presentation in I've been able in a history class here. The history professor invited me to talk about this work, which I did. Of course, I talk about it with my creative writing students because creative writers often think that creative writing just comes out of your own head. And they don't know that they can do research. You can do research in creative writing, and that you can pull on history and science. You can pull on research from a variety of different fields and use it in your creative work. So I obviously I share this with my students and the possibilities that this kind of work allows.
Yeah, that's great. Dr. Holly Karapetkova, thanks so much for your time. It's been
Thank
great
you.
talking with you and learning more about your process as well as your research and your eventual manuscript work.
Thank you.
That'll do it for this episode of Faculty in Focus. Thanks so much for watching.